Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that brings behavioral insights from researchers, authors, and practitioners to help you in your work and life. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Our little podcast has some news to share. We've published 354 episodes, and we've had some amazing conversations with people along the way. And those conversations have led us to be acknowledged by some really terrific organizations, such as Habit Weekly named us Podcast of the Year twice.
Woohoo!
Amazing. And Psychology Today listed us as one of the 21 psychology podcasts that every business person should listen to. Now, this is very cool, and we are very grateful for all of it. And we've added another one to the list. We've just been named the 2023 Behavioral Science Podcast of the Year by GABS.
For those of you who don't know, GABS is the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. It's the first association for applied behavioral science, and they are a pretty rigorous group. You can't just sign up and get in. You have to go through an application process, which, Tim, I wasn't quite sure if we were going to pass. I have to be honest. Wasn't quite sure when we signed up. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I was going to get in. I felt like you kind of came through with flying colors, but it was quite a process. But all of that adds to the feeling that getting this award from GABS, the Behavioral Science Podcast of the Year, it's a big deal, a really big deal.
It is a big deal because it's from our peers, from people who really care about the application of behavioral science like we do. And the field of finalists was amazing. I mean, there was Katie Milkman's Choiceology podcast, Stephen Dubner's Freakonomics Radio, Neriel's Near and Far. I mean, to be even listed with those people and those podcasts is just amazing, but that we actually won, I don't know. All I can say is just wow.
Yeah. And Groovers, if you're interested in paying it forward just a bit, please scroll down to the bottom of your app that you're listening to us on and give us a quick rating or a short review. These reviews and ratings help other people who are interested in the practice of applied behavioral science find behavioral grooves.
And when you leave a positive review, it's even more of a big deal for us than any award we get from any association or other place on there, because it means that hopefully we made an impact in your life. Yeah.
Oh, that's just so sweet and fluffy.
All right. It might not mean quite as much, but it's really important for us, and we really do appreciate it, and it does help others find us. And with that, Tim, I think we really need to get to our guest. What do you think? Should we just quit
yes, actually, on with the
show. on us about how great we are and how much everybody should be. Yeah, on with the show. All right. So in this episode, we are sharing our conversation with Richard Shotton, who is the author of The Illusion of Choice, 16 and a half psychological biases that influence what we buy. And he was introduced to us by one of our friends and our two-time guest in this behavioral science journey that we're on, Matt Johnson.
Yeah, that was so nice of him. And God, that title is just clever as hell, isn't it?
Yeah, but there really are just 16 and a half chapters on the biases. So it's very accurate, too. Yeah. And, of course, we're not going to tell you which is the half chapter. You're just going to have to read it to find out.
So Richard started his career as a media planner and has since become the founder of Astro10, a consultancy that applies behavioral science to marketing. And let me just say something about this book. It's a really good read for marketers. Yeah. Highly recommended.
Yeah, but more importantly, it was a really good conversation that we had with Richard. And we talked about some of the classic behavioral science stuff, such as the IKEA effect, and we spent a fair amount of time on language, which fit nicely after our conversation with Jonah Berger. We talked about some of the impact of precise versus imprecise words. We even touched on the replication crisis. And Tim, I know you said this is a really good read for marketers, but I think that overall, this has been a really good read. It's a really good conversation for anybody.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, and Richard had some really cogent things to say, or should I say, he had some smart ideas to share about the replication crisis.
Well,
in
you had
particular.
some smart ideas, simpler words there, Mr. Houlihan. I see you're taking some of his advice. Simpler words
Absolutely.
to talk about a whole bunch of things. Very
But
smart
with
ideas.
with that, Groovers, we hope that you sit back with a generous pour of the most erudite vernacular intoxicant that you can pronounce.
I can't pronounce
All
that,
right.
that's for sure.
And enjoy our conversation with Richard Shotton. Richard Shotton, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Very nice to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. We are really grateful to have you as a guest. We've been fans for a long time, and we're going to have to start with the speed round because that is just what we do. So let's start with an easy one. Would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite actor or favorite musician?
Oh, musician, definitely. I have quite socially unacceptable views about actors. I feel like we give too much attention to actors and actresses. So, definitely musician.
Interesting. So it would be a political statement for you to actually not have dinner with an actor.
Yes, I think so. I think, I find it strange at the end of TV shows you have credits, but maybe I should keep these unpopular views to myself.
All right, we'll
no one gives you a list of who's made your burger. It feels strange that we give certain jobs this acclamation and not to most jobs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good.
Well, let's make sure we're not alienating any of your fans because they're going, oh wait, I love actors here, and we'll move to this next one. And this kind of goes back a little bit to some of the things that you talk about in your book. So, do you prefer German wine or French wine, or does it depend on the music that's playing in the wine shop when you're buying it?
Oh, very good question. I think I prefer French, but I've never done a blind test, so I'm probably applying into the blending here. Yeah.
Oh,
fair enough.
And it's one of our favorite studies we've talked about too, is just that idea that, you're influenced by more things and subtle things than you think. And so we'll probably talk about that as we get into the actual conversation here.
Yeah. Okay, third speed round question. Words, concrete or abstract? Which is best for marketers to use to get their brands more recognized?
No, that's the easy one. Concrete, definitely concrete.
Snap.
All right. And these, this is atypical for us because we're asking like a bunch of questions that refer right back into your book. And most of the time we try to just do, more crazy fun ones, but they were all really good. So we added them in. All right. Last speed round question, Richard. If you're at a coffee shop, would you rather be awarded a coffee after your 10th purchase or just randomly given a free coffee at the barista's discretion?
Oh, I'm a big fan of being rewarded randomly. I think if you're given one after 10, it just feels like a transaction. If you are given one at the barista's discretion, it feels like, you're particularly friendly or nice. So you feel rewarded.
Why? Why is that? Why do we tend to feel more rewarded in that random sense?
I think because you feel like you have been selected. I mean, if I've done my part of the bargain and just bought 10 coffees and got the 11th free, that's a commercial transaction. The barista, the brand haven't done me a favor. If I go in, there's no promise of a free coffee, they just give one out from seemingly the goodness of their heart, then, I feel like I've personally been selected and I'm probably overconfident about the reasons why I was selected.
I love the idea of how you frame that and this idea that I was selected. And again, as we know how our human brains work, we fill in those reasons, as you said. How can marketers use this? So, and as you're thinking about this, obviously your book that is really framed around and built around marketing, but how do marketers, can they use this uncertainty effect?
Okay, so there's a lovely study by Shen and Fishback where they look into the difference between fixed rewards and uncertain rewards. And in their study, they get people to drink, I think it's 3 pints of water through a straw in 2 minutes. And if people succeed, the first half of the participants are told they will get $2, and roughly 40% succeed in that setup. Next half of people, same challenge, 3 pints of water, 2 minutes of straw, But this time they're told, well, if you succeed, we'll flick a coin. If it lands on one side, you get $1. If it lands on the other, you get $2. Now, in that scenario, even though the expected benefit of the challenge is going to be less, it's going to be $1.50 on average, people are more likely to succeed. They are more motivated to succeed. So you've got of the order of about 70% of people succeed in that scenario. So I think the argument goes here that it's not just the financial incentive that motivates us to want to complete the task. It's also the excitement of a small gamble. What's interesting from a marketer's perspective, you can take that study and think, well, how do we apply this to our loyalty schemes? Because most loyalty schemes, most reward schemes are very transactional in nature. As you said, you buy 10 coffees, you get the 11th free. You go to a supermarket, you spend £100, you get £1 or $1 back in vouchers. Shen and Fishback would say, well, that's not the ideal setup. What you should do is introduce an element of variability. Empower your staff to give out 1 in 10 coffees roughly, randomly for free. Don't give 100% of people 1% off, give 1% of people 100% off, or 10% of people 10% off. It's the same mathematical equation, but it leads to a very, very different reaction. There's a small chain of curry restaurants in Britain called Dishoom, and they use this brilliantly. On Mondays, I think it is, when not many people want to go to a curry restaurant or a restaurant at all, they have a really nice promotion. You go in, you order your drinks, you order your food. At the end of the meal, just before you get the bill, they bring out a board and a big brass dice called a matka. You roll the matka, it's 6-sided. If a 6 comes up, everything you've ordered, all your food and drinks, completely free. Now, to a mathematician, to the business, it sounds like it's a 16.66% discount. But the way people react is completely different. No one would change not many people would change their behaviour for a small discount like that. But the thought of getting this food for free and the reaction that it engenders is completely different. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for marketers.
Yeah, it's interesting, again, as we talk through these pieces, the way that our brains process what classical economics would say, that seems really crazy. The idea, as you talked about, drinking the water through the straws, $2 versus $1 or $2. And yet it happens. And this is the piece that I think is really interesting about bringing behavioral science, psychology into business. And so, you've been endorsed by, the book has been endorsed by a number of big names in the field, like Rory Sutherland, Robert Cialdini, Neriel, Jonah Berger, Seth Steven Davidowitz, who we've all had on the show. Yeah. So, what was missing? What are you hoping to get this book and kind of bring to the field? Are you looking to kind of bring a new perspective? What's your hope for this book?
So I think if you stop someone on the street who didn't work in marketing and you ask them what kind of disciplines, what academic subjects do you think advertisers and marketers use, I think most of those people would say at the top of the list would be psychology. At the top of the list would be behavioral science. I think most people would find it's very strange that an industry that is interested in changing the behaviors of people does not draw every single day on an academic discipline that experiments on what effectively changes behavior. Now, I think agencies and brands are mad slightly not to use this basically free resource. There are thousands of wonderfully clever people. As you said, Ariely, Kahneman, Jonah Berger, all these brilliant minds are working at your disposal, essentially. They're running experiments. They're finding out what can change behavior effectively. All of these ideas are open to you as a marketer to use. The problem, though, and I hope the book resolves some of this, is unfortunately many academics write in a very turgid, statistic-heavy style. And I think that problem's got worse, I think. I've heard people refer to it as physics envy. You go back to some of the classic papers in the 1950s or 1960s, and they're beautifully written, very simple, very few statistics. You read more recent journal papers, and they're dripping in very complex, perhaps unnecessarily complex statistics. So I don't think agencies and advertisers are using behavioral science as much as they should. And what I want to do in both the choice factor and the illusion of choice is show people that these studies are very relevant to advertisers. The underlying principles are very, very simple, and they can easily, at often low cost, be applied to a great effect.
I want to go back to the speed round question that I asked about words, because I think that this kind of connects to what you're talking about here in missing things. When marketers have the ability to use more concrete words versus more abstract words, they're often not choosing it. They're not making a better choice. You bring up a great story about Apple in their branding, and I was wondering if first of all, if you could relate that story. And then can you tell us why you think marketers are missing the boat on applying this remarkably rich resource, especially in this specific domain, in just using good specific words?
So the original study is by a wonderful Canadian psychologist called Ian Begg. And back in 1972, when he was at the University of Western Ontario, he recruits, I think, 24 students. It's of that ilk, 2024. And he reads out a list of 22-word phrases. And he randomizes the order, but some of those words are what he calls concrete phrases, tangible things like square door. Others are what he calls abstract phrases.
Yeah, two-word combinations, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the abstract ones are things like basic truth or impossible amount. Then he asks people quite quickly, after they've read through the list, to recall as much as they can. And on average, people remember 9% of the abstract words, 36% of the concrete words. So you've got this huge swing in memorability. His explanation is the most powerful of our senses is vision. If people can picture the thing that you are describing, it's sticky. If they can't picture it, it's very forgettable. Now, that I think is fascinating for advertisers, because what it suggests is you have to translate your abstract objective. Say you want to prove to people you're premium or trustworthy or high quality. Those are intangibles that can't be pictured. The language you use has to translate that abstract objective into much more visualizable, concrete language. You mentioned Apple, and I think they were experts at doing this. And I think the ad you were referring to is the one that launched or was very early on for the iPod. So they had the objective of communicating this abstract benefit of memory. You've got lots of storage, lots of memory. What every one of their competitors did is communicate that abstract objective with abstract language. 256 megabytes of memory. Very, very forgettable ads. What Apple did so brilliantly is translate that abstract objective into very visualizable language. 1,000 songs in your pocket. You can picture a pocket, and that makes it sticky. That makes it memorable. So it's a lovely tactic that advertisers can use. If you find yourself communicating in language that is complicated and you cannot visualize it, you are not going to be remembered. What you've got to do is sit down and think, how can I turn this idea into something that my audience will be able to picture?
Is it fair to say it's just hard? That it's not as easy as it seems? I mean, as we're talking about it, there's something that just seems so reasonable and accessible about, I'll just use concrete language. But it is more difficult than that, right?
Well, so I wonder, because the other half of your question was, well, why don't people use it? Because you're right, it seems a bit perplexing that if it's this simple, why isn't everyone doing it? And the reason I mentioned the sample size and the fact it was students as well for the Begg study is one thing that I think puts advertisers off. They hear a study, it's more than 50 years old, it was run a very small sample, the sample wasn't representative, and therefore their action is ignore it. That, I think, is fair to a degree, but the reaction shouldn't be ignore the finding. It should be to think that finding is an untested hypothesis. Let's recreate it. And it doesn't have to be complicated. So I reran that study with Mike Trahan, who's at Leo Burnett's. We got a much, much larger sample, 400 plus, I think. Reran the study. We changed the words. So there was no talk about horses or basic truth. It was things like fast car, more commercial language, or trusted provenance. And we also put in a gap between reading out or letting people read the words and then asking them to recall them. And not only did we find Begg's results stood, they were much more extreme. So we found a 10-fold variation in memorability when you had a nationally representative audience. And I think probably most importantly, you put this time gap in.
Yeah, so, which was like five minutes?
Not long at all. So we would have ideally done the next day, but we were constrained. We bookended a survey. So if anything, I think our results probably still underestimate the genuine impact.
Yeah.
So I think one half of why behavioural science doesn't get applied enough is there is a straw man idea in some organisations that this is a abstract field run in labs on students. They imagine that the techniques of the 1950s are still used today. And I think a lot of people don't realise that many of these studies have been run in very, very naturalistic circumstances.
Yeah. So, Richard, I want to dig down deeper on what you were just talking about, because one of the things I loved about the book is that you do take a number of these older studies that might have some of those limitations, low sample size, low power, etc., and rerun them mostly in field. Actually, I think all in field, right? As you're looking at those, was there, and you do that throughout the book. You kind of keep referencing, oh, we did this and this was the old one. This was it. Was there any of those that when you repeated them or when you did that they surprised you more than others? Was this one finding a 10-fold increase as opposed to just 50%? I mean, what was the most surprising aspect of doing some of those?
They're very good points. I think partly, maybe to agree this one because of the scale of the impact. I haven't seen many other studies which see a 10-fold impact. The other one, I think I'm always most interested and most surprised by the thing I did last. I kind of
proximity effect. Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. I'm very highly recently dependent, if that's a word. Sorry. So I did a really interesting study, and I think it was too late for the book. In fact,
okay.
I did it with Michael Aaron at Xenosci and a love agents in America. And we were interested in the pennies a day effect. So you've got this finding in charity work where if you ask someone for £1 a day or $1 a day, they're more likely to donate than if you ask for $30 a month, even if the condition is you have to pay £1 every day. I reran that study around what I would call temporal reframing for commercial brands in the choice factory. And we found the result held. But then last year, we began to wonder, well, not every brand sells over time. Some brands sell in volume. Would you see a similar effect if you talk about the unit price rather than the total price? So the study we did, 282 people, all told around about Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, $18.99 for a 12-pack, and they're all asked how good value they think that 12-pack is. First half of people get it exactly as I've just said, and I think it's 13.7 think the brand is good or great value. The second half of people get the same base question, but we added on half a dozen words, which were, that's the same as $1.58 a bottle. And there you see a huge increase. It's more than double. 28% of people now think it's good or great value. So that, I'm fascinated by the psychology of price, but the scale of that impact surprised me. That it wasn't people were misleadingly told it's $1.58 a bottle if you buy 12. It was, this 12-pack is $18.99. That's the same as $1.58. So I thought when we put that kind of more realistic version in, it would dampen the effect. But we still got doubling.
That is fascinating. That being more granular increased the sense of value.
Yes. I put this down to almost a Daniel Kahneman's phrase of Wisiati. What you see is all there is. People don't draw on all the information about the price that is relevant. They draw on what's salient. So if you give equal weight, in the example I just gave, equal weight to the subunit cost, people react slightly naively and think 158 is a small amount, and therefore it has that, positive associations with it.
Does it have anything to do with precision? Because you start off the book in precision, and you really bring this idea that precision impacts the way we think and believability and expertise. And I'm almost, as you're saying this, it kind of goes, that is a more precise element within that pricing scheme.
Yes, I'm pretty sure I should double check because I'm doing it from memory. But I think it was $18.99. So it was the total cost was quite precise. But you're right. Generally, if you break it down to units, you'll end up being more precise. So in the book, I talk about a Schindler study which shows that perceived accuracy and credibility is increased with precise versus round numbers. But maybe even more relevant, and again, I think this just missed the book. I think I read it too late. I came across I think it was a 5-year-old podcast with Chen. I think it's Keith Chen, head behavioral scientist at Uber.
Uber, yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And he talked about a wonderful study they did. And I think it's wonderful because massive scale and people don't know they're taking part in an experiment. They're just going around their everyday business ordering Ubers. And he talks about an experiment where people were randomly dropped into one of two, say, groups. Some people saw a surge price for 2x. Some saw a surge price for 2.1x. And what he showed was that people were more likely to accept the 2.1x price rather than the 2x price. So as you say, contrary to what a classical economist would predict, you can increase the price, but because it has this aura of precision, this aura of being better value, people are more likely to accept it. And I love that because the original work around precise prices by Januszewski and Yu was in a slightly convoluted lab setting. So again, it's another example of this progression of behavioral science where some of those findings, which we may have treated with a degree of caution, are being proved in the real world.
Yeah. Richard, can you tell us a little bit more about, you kind of briefly talked about the reason that is kind of hypothesized why precision is important. Can you expand on that?
Oh, yeah. So I think there are different arguments for credibility and accuracy, and then different arguments for why a price feels better. So in terms of accuracy and credibility, the study there was Schindler back in 2006, where he recruits a group of people, shows them all an ad for a deodorant, and some people see a claim that the deodorant reduces perspiration by 50%. Some see a claim that it reduces perspiration by either 47 or 53%. And he shows that the group that see the precise claim, there is a 10% increase in accuracy, a 5% increase in credibility. Now, the explanation for that is that over time, people learn from their experience in life that if a communicator is talking in generalities, they generally don't know what they're talking about. If they are talking in specifics, they're more likely to know. And I always think there's a nice personal example you could put here. You know, if someone put you on the spot now and said, "How old's your sister?" you might say they're 43 or 46. If someone said, "How old is that bloke that lives 5 doors down on your street, that old guy who lives just around the corner?" you'd say they're in their 60s, they're in their 70s. So we tend to gravitate almost naturally towards this precision if we know what we're talking about. But if we are uncertain, we broaden the scope of our language. And I think over time, people fuse that connection. They learn that connection. So we assume, we hear a precise number, it must be accurate. We hear a general number, we are starting to doubt the communicator. So that's
Tim,
one part.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Tim, that just means that we are viewed as really imprecise and, the generalities that we always bring up. So sorry, listeners. We are not the precise people that you want to be listening to. We do know our stuff. We just can't remember it. So there you go.
I wonder how the precision sort of, I'm getting back to words because you brought up Danny Oppenheimer's study about, who, by the way, just have to shout out to Danny because he was a guest on our podcast as well. But this idea of using the simple versus verbose jargon, and that it was sort of a counterintuitive result. Right, that rather than thinking that the more intelligent people were using all this verbose jargon, that actually those who the simpler version increased the perception of intelligence. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great one to talk about. Partly because it's one of the rare examples of an academic paper, the title being a bit of a joke. So the
he is.
The title is great.
That's totally Danny. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's consequences of erudite vernacular utilized irrespective of necessity. :
Yes.
Dangers of using long words needlessly. Yes. So I think he deserves a medal for coming up with that title. That's brilliant. So people
I
are
think he
familiar
got
with
I think he actually won an Ig Nobel award.
Oh,
for that. He was, there's the Nobel
yes.
Prize, but there's the Ig Nobel as well. The counterfactual of it. And if I remember right, he was actually awarded an Ig Nobel or Ig Nobel award.
I mean,
for that.
I'm never sure. Is Ig Nobel? Are they trying to criticize you, or is it actually a slight badge of praise? It sounds a bit crazy, but actually underneath there's something important there.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the latter. It's the latter. They're not. It's not. They're not saying this is bad. They're actually saying this is. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, but
yeah, sorry. Because I think if people do speak more simply in business, it would be a massive boon to all of us. So yeah, the study that he does is a lovely one. So he gets abstracts of academic studies, which are often written in a verbose, unnecessarily complicated style, and he shows those abstracts to a group of people, and they rate the intelligence of the author. Then he takes that same abstract, shows it to another group of people. But he has altered the abstract slightly. He's taken out the unnecessarily complicated words and put in simpler replacements. Now, when that group rates the intelligence of the author, it's something like a 15%-ish, and I'm not 100% sure here, a 15% improvement in terms of their ratings of intelligence. So as you say, quite a surprising finding that actually we tend to assume that if someone has written simply and clearly, they are more intelligent than someone who's written in a verbose style. So I wonder if there's an element here of you start off with knowledge of being kind of simplistic. Then as you learn a little, you begin to overcomplicate things. And ideally, as you get better and better in your field, you begin to be able to translate it into kind of simpler language. So maybe people pick up on that slightly. But there is a great, again, learning there for marketers in that so many marketers, especially in B2B, especially in serious subjects like finance or health, they communicate using unnecessarily complicated words. I think the problem here often lies with the generalist marketer. Every copywriter, or most copywriters who are good at their job, they know the importance of simplicity. But the language they have to defend that simple writing is often, or that evidence that they have is often evidence that might work on them, but it's not going to work on a generalist marketer or a finance director. They might quote, for example, a dictum from Orwell along these lines of, always use the kind of basic English rather than the complicated, Latin-derived words. But the problem is that's what would influence them. It's not what would influence a logical, rational thinker. So I think if copywriters know about some of these experiments, they can use the experiments to defend the principles that they already hold dear. And that, I think, is sometimes a really powerful use for advertisers and marketers. Sometimes behavioral science tells us really counterintuitive things. Sometimes it tells us things that we already believe in, but we're unable to defend in a bureaucratic organization. And if you take a peer-reviewed paper and you take people through, here's the author, here's the date, here's the methodology, here's the results, I think it has this wonderful power of switching the conversation from should we communicate simply to how. What are the actual words that we're going to swap? How are we going to be simple?
Two of the chapters in your book right after each other. I love this. Is chapter 2 is called Make It Easy, and chapter 3 is called Make It Difficult. So help us understand, Richard, how can both of these be true? You're at one point saying make it easy, and then the other part you're saying make it difficult. Help our listeners understand that you're not just some crazy guy out there, taking whatever's out there. There's some real stuff behind that.
I think so. I can tell you, just reading the chapter headings might seem slightly contradictory. But I try and make the argument that, to begin with, there are an awful lot of studies that show if you want to change behavior, removing friction can have an outsized effect. What's really interesting, in fact, is you think probably the two most respected behavioral scientists, Richard Thaler, Daniel Kahneman, on separate occasions when they have been asked what's the single biggest thing that they've ever learned about this field, they often reply with a very similar answer. Make it easy. So you've got this body of work, people like Bergman and Rogers, showing that if you take a small bit of friction out of the customer journey, you tend to have an outsized effect. So there's a whole chapter around some of the nuances of that. But then I follow it with another chapter, which is seemingly disagreeing with it, which is make it difficult. But one of the studies I draw on there, for example, is Dan Ariely, Michael Norton, and the IKEA effect. So I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the IKEA effect. The basic idea is the more effort we put into a product, or more effort we put into something, the more we appreciate it. So at first, it feels like behavioral science is trying to have it both ways. And I know that's often a criticism. You can find a bias to back up whatever you want. But when you dig into those different studies, you find something that there's something slightly different about them. Make It Easy is about changing behavior. The IKEA effect is changing perception of a product. So if you want to boost your quality perceptions, completely agree, it might be worth adding a bit of friction in. But if you want people to buy your product, to change their behavior, to exercise more, that's when you should be removing the friction. So it's very much the approach that you've got to be very clear about what is the barrier or what is the problem you are trying to resolve as a marketer. And once you're clear about that, then it's easy to match the right behavioral science experiment and therefore the right recommendation to that problem.
That's a great way of phrasing it, Richard. That's really beautifully summarized. I was happy to see you address this idea of increasing friction as a benefit. Because of some of my own work, I've helped develop a goal-setting strategy in incentive programs where the salesperson has to, instead of just being enrolled automatically in the incentive, they actually had to go and select the level of performance that they were going to achieve. And the consequence of not hitting that right would mean that they get no reward, or they just get a much smaller reward. So it slowed them down for just a minute. It engaged that system to thinking just long enough to, that a bit of friction to get them to think about, oh, well, how much effort do I really want to put forth? How much effort do I have? Capability, opportunity, all those kinds of things. And it's still an incredibly successful model for increasing performance among salespeople by getting them to slow down and contemplate for just a half a second, where will I be? How much effort can I put into it? How well can I do? So I thought that was just a fantastic thing that you juxtapose those two as well.
Yeah.
So
excellent. I think again, I was just slightly after the book. I think that I heard someone make the comment that they thought, and I've forgotten who it is, I can't credit them, but they made the comment that San Pellegrino were applying this principle of make it difficult very well.
Oh.
So, and this is one of those where it might vary by market, but what they used to do, and I think they might have phased it out for budget savings, is you would have your standard squat 330 milliliter can, like a Coke can, but they put a foil lid on top. And I thought there is something there. It makes it feel special. You've got to go to the effort to unpeel it and reveal it. It's a bit like the difference between a cork and a bottle of wine and then a screw cap and a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
You're giving someone a little bit of theatre, a little bit of effort. Hopefully they appreciate it more.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, the wine is actually really interesting because the corks tend to have actually worse performance in keeping that wine the way that it needs to be. And yet there's a big resistance into changing that. And that partly probably because of that particular aspect of it. So,
yes. And there might be some sense in the traditionalists who are rejecting screw caps in that they recognize people are not computers and automatons that just analyze the physical constituents of a drink. Part of what we taste is what we expect to taste. And if people wrongly or rightly have this set of associations about the traditional cork, be very, very careful about removing it.
It could have some, the uncertainty effect too. There's a certain number of bottles that this may not be good, So it's like it's the lottery effect here as we're going again. All of these factors coming into play.
Yeah. So and that's interesting because then it starts to get quite complicated because it would probably depend on what proportion of bottles are corks and bad tasting, because there is a lovely set of studies. I think I mentioned it right at the back of the book about when I talk about the peak end rule, that there is a negativity bias. I think, and apologies if this is one of, I think it was Prato who did the study, gives people a list of 20 words, and there is a mix of positive and negative words. So maybe generosity would be a positive word, meanness would be the negative. And after people read through them, she asked people to recall as many as they can. And I think it was the order of about a twofold greater likelihood of remembering the negative words than the positive ones. So this argument would be, a negativity bias, one or two bad events have a disproportionate effect in terms of our memory of wine as a category. So yeah, there is a slight, there's a bit of a gamble there. And then maybe over time, you're not doing yourself any favors with a couple of horrible bottles.
We're talking a lot. We've mentioned many academic papers, research projects, and something that is important to you is the replication of those. It's a theme throughout the whole book. And I was wondering if we could turn that just to look a little bit at the replication crisis, or the so-called replication crisis, and get some of your thoughts about what you think about how the replication crisis has been framed sort of within the community of academics and then in the popular press as well.
Yeah. So I think there's two interesting parts about the replication crisis. The first of all is the project of rerunning studies is a very, very valuable thing. And if some of those studies, existing, historic, famous studies, are found no longer to work, it is much better to know that than not know it. So I think, Tim, you mentioned this at another occasion, that the word crisis is maybe the wrong word. It's a very loaded, negative word.
Very much so.
That some studies don't robustly replicate is not a problem in and of itself. It's only a problem if people keep on referencing and reusing debunked studies. So I think that's one really important area, because many marketers use the replication crisis as a stick to beat behavioral scientists with. But the irony there is marketers, especially a lot of the data sets that we use in Britain, many of the very famous research projects that have been created have never even been rerun, or there's been no attempt at replicating them. That is a far, far worse situation, because you don't know whether you have a bogus finding or not if you haven't tried to rerun it. Much, much better if you rerun lots of studies and then you purge the field of those studies that aren't worthy.
Yeah. I want to go going to switch this around. So in one of the components that you talked about freedom of choice, the idea of reactance is a topic in the book, and you have a tip: avoid overly assertive messages when communicating with your loyal customers. And I know that you're focusing in on marketing, but I do a lot of internal work within organizations and employee things. And I would say that is the same aspect when you're communicating with employees, is sometimes that we overly, take some of this. And I'm wondering if you see the insights that you get from this book, are they applicable across other domains outside of just marketing, particularly as it relates to internal employee communication and kind of the work inside of companies?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, firstly, the point you make around people who really like a brand are more likely to react poorly to authoritarian, pushy messages. I've never thought about it the way that you just mentioned it, but I think you're absolutely right. However much you like a brand, you don't have a sense of ownership about it or a sense of affinity in the same way that the employee has. So I think you're right that the expectation would be authoritarian messages from managers are more likely to create reactance than anything a brand does. And I wonder if there's something similar around being a citizen. That are you more likely to push back against authoritarian messages from a government as well, because you feel like there's a different type of relationship than there is with a brand. So I think that's a fascinating area. Speculating completely, but I think I agree with you. But then your point about that kind of broader point of, can some of these experiments be used on professionals? I would say the majority of studies that have been rerun amongst professionals show the biases are still effective, but the scale of the impact might vary. So, for example, there is a lovely study about the impact of small pieces of friction on doctors. It's a 2014 to 2017 study by Olshan. I think it's the Penn Medical Unit. And what he does is look at the proportion of drugs that doctors are recommending or prescribing, that are generic versus branded. And in the first half of the study, there is a drop-down menu on the prescription interface, and the doctors get the branded drugs first, and then beneath them, it's the generics. And in that setup, 75% of the drugs recommended are generic. I think it's 2017-ish. Towards the end of the study, they flip the interface. So now doctors log on to their prescription interface on their computers. It's the generics at the top, branded at the bottom. So now, if you want to get a branded medicine, it's an extra 2 or 3 seconds of effort. You would think for a rational, considered decision maker should make no difference. But it does.
And they're doctors, and you're thinking, this is not, you're going, all right, they are experts in this field. They should have an opinion. Anyway, keep continuing.
Yeah. Sorry, no, you're absolutely right. It's a very good point to emphasize. They are doctors. We're not talking about estate agents or media planners or clothes where, we haven't taken a Hippocratic oath. This is a group of people who are highly intelligent, probably have a real strong self-identity about being rational, logical decision makers. Yet, when there's that flip, when it's slightly harder to order a branded drug, the proportion of generics goes up to 98%. So it was 75, now it's 98. The principle that we've seen again and again about small bits of friction affecting consumers, Amazon moving to one-click purchasing, Netflix flicking to or switching to autoplay rather than having to choose the next program. We've seen it amongst consumers. Work by Olshan and his colleagues shows just the same with professionals. The only difference is probably those professionals are far more loath to admit that they're affected by those small particles. Yeah.
They are. My personal experience with friends of mine who are physicians, they reject that outright. They're like, no, that's not me. I'm like, well, it's you. It's all of us, by the way.
Yes. This is behavioral science is sort of human nature, not consumer nature.
Yeah. Richard, we did talk a little bit about Apple and their 1,000 songs in your pocket comment earlier, which is pretty fascinating. Let's zero in on an imaginary state where you get to put 2 songs in your pocket or 2 artists in your pocket, and you get to be on a desert island for a year. What 2 artists would you put in your pocket?
That's a great question, because I think the desert island for a year, you'd want someone with variety. So I think I'm going to go David Bowie would be the first and obvious choice. I think
big catalog, lots of variety. Yeah.
And Ziggy Stardust, 2 of my favorite albums. I think they're amazing. But then for the second, if I'm on a desert island, I probably need to be doing a bit of exercise to keep reasonably healthy. So then I want something that's a little bit more adrenaline fueled. So maybe I'll go for the Strokes as a second ice. Yeah.
Okay. You didn't bring up the Verve.
No, I didn't bring up the Verve. I'm a big fan of Richard Ashcroft and the Verve, but they would be equally good. Yeah. Oh, but I think I'll go for the Strokes and David Bowie. Yeah.
So, are you a big '90s alt indie rock fan?
So those were my formative years. So I would have been 15 in 1990. So yeah, a lot of my youth I saw Primal Scream, and I saw the Strokes when they did Is This It album at Brixton Academy. So yeah, that was the kind of music I liked then. And back in the 90s, I would have just listened to that kind of music. Cure, Wonder Stuff, Stone Roses. What has changed though, and what I love, and why I think Spotify is one of the greatest ever inventions, is it encourages experimentation. So I, as a 15-year-old, would never, ever have listened to heavy metal. I'd never listened to rap. I would never listen to country and western. Whereas now, I've got into John Prine. I like Public Enemy. There are Heavy metal, maybe less, but there are a couple of songs that I quite like. But yeah.
You're not downloading Metallica, and just going off the edge on there. All right.
No,
so.
but I do love the fact that you can try these types of music, and there's no financial cost. Whereas I would never have dreamt of spending £15 or £10 of money buying an album in a genre that other than indie music back at 15.
I think it's interesting, and Tim, you probably have better insight on this. I think one of the interesting things is, yes, we can explore a variety of different genres and different pieces. But I think there has been some studies that show that we don't know who those artists are when we do that on Spotify, because particularly if we get it on a randomized kind of component. And so the following of these newer bands that are coming out in various different pieces is less than it was when you were, because, I grew up in the 80s as my formative years, and I had the bands that I got every album they had and, followed them religiously. And I think that has tapered off outside of a few maybe bigger artists that are out there. And it's an interesting conundrum,
Yeah. I think it may be, in a way, you are competing now as a musician with all of the music of the last 50 years, which is very, very hard. And actually, the people I've mentioned, the ones that I've started listening to, have not been new modern bands. It's things that somehow I missed when I was 15 or younger. Yeah.
Or you mentioned John Prine. I mean, he had a whole catalog before you were born.
I'd never heard of him until 2020, and I think Spotify radio put him on. Said to it, "Who's this?" And he's one of those people that I've gone and explored and listened to hundreds of songs. I think it's absolutely amazing. Yeah, completely changed my view about. Would you call that country and western? I'm not sure about the kind of genre names.
I think he grew up in a more of a folk environment, but he grew up just south of the Mason-Dixon line in the U.S., so sometimes it does have a bit more of a country vibe. But
yeah.
But he's always got great stories to tell. He's a fantastic,
wonderful
wordplay. Yeah. Richard, it is such a treat to have you on Behavior Grooves. Thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you. It's been brilliant fun. Thank you.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on our discussion that we had with Richard, take a deep dive into some topics, and talk about whatever else comes into our very concrete and accurate and specific brains.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's focus on the importance of avoiding abstract language when we have the opportunity to be more specific and concrete.
Well, let's not just no. I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay. Yep.
Because as we learned with Jonah, sometimes abstract language is absolutely appropriate, and we should be using it. We just need to use our concrete, accurate words in the appropriate manner at the appropriate time, like at 8:45 or whatever in the morning when we're doing this.
Well, let's talk about what's a good time. When is it appropriate, or when's it really good to use that very specific and concrete language compared to more abstract language?
Yeah. So as Richard was talking about, right, when we use concrete, accurate, specific language, what that does is it creates this perception that people trust that information more, right? They also remember it more. And so anytime that you are trying to build trust and make sure you get a specific memory kind of going in a product, if you're talking about price or various other things, it's often better, but it also requires more processing and various different things, which is part of the reason why it's memorable. So if you're looking at pricing situation and it is a emotional buy, or at the counter as you're leaving, the shop, $2 candy bar might be better than a $1.99 candy bar at that point, because it just is an emotional. It's less concrete and it's just easier to do. So there are reasons that when again you use more abstract, it's like getting people to think larger. And again, as we talked about, I think it was with Jonah or was Richard. I'm getting these confused. Uber can talk about it's an app that gets you from point A to point B, but when you're going out to kind of investors, you want to have them think about changing the landscape of,
context.
Yeah.
Context matters very much so, which I think it was really interesting when we, and again, I'm conflating the two conversations as well, but the difference between 250 megabytes worth of storage for music and 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Right.
So we have this very concrete 250 megabytes, and then we have something that's going to be a little more relatable with 1,000 songs in my pocket,
which is also very concrete. So this was interesting. This was with Richard. And so this idea that, when Apple came out with their, what was it? iPods. Thank you. I can't even remember what the name was, right? But when they came out with iPod, that marketing thing about 1,000 songs in my pocket, I was, again, as Richard was saying, really, really good because it was concrete. 250 megabytes is also concrete.
Very concrete.
Right? Yeah. But I don't know what 250 megabytes relates to for me. I know what 1,000 songs in my pocket does. And all of a sudden, I can remember that, right? So 250 megabytes is accurate. It's specific, but it doesn't mean anything. 1,000 songs in my pocket is concrete and it means something. And I think that's the piece that's really important.
Apple used that model of the number of songs that an iPod would hold for many years. I was impressed to see how they used it as a comparative measure. So that as they came out with new models, they said, well, this one holds 5,000 songs and this one holds 10,000 songs. And as you increase the amount of memory, they didn't express it in megabytes or some kind of standard scientific memory tool. They expressed it in the number of songs.
Right.
And I think that was a really effective marketing message that they carried on for several years. Now, when they got into iPhones, everything got conflated because the phone does so many things.
Right.
So it lost its vigor.
Right. And
which was fine.
Which is fine. It's really interesting when we think about that, though, because again, when Apple did that, they didn't have behavioral scientists on their advertising team and marketing team to say, oh, we're going to use these concrete because this because of big study from 1973 that talks about the imaging integration of recall of words that I read in the Canadian Journal of Psychology, and that what is this? 9% of abstract words versus 36% of concrete words are remembered by people when they're doing this. No, they don't. Did you like how I changed my voice there?
I like that.
Yeah,
you should do that all the time.
Trying to be that.
You sounded much more credible, more relatable as an authority figure. Yeah,
that would be. That's another interesting study that could be done. Like how voice what's the word?
Informed us.
Yeah.
Informs us. It influences us.
No, inflection,
improves
I
us.
was going to say.
Okay.
It had the I part there at the beginning. There you go. Informs, inflection, All right. We digress.
Let's also talk about friction because friction is a great story of Richard emphasized the idea that it's not always about reducing friction, that there are times, there's contexts in which adding friction can be a really important thing. And I thought that was a really good point, especially for marketers and HR professionals. I just felt like this was a masterful comment to make, an observation.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before, this idea that if you are working in business, whether it is in marketing, advertising, pricing, whatever it would be, or inside of an organization, that friction in and of itself, Roger Dooley will talk about this, right? And is this idea that most of the time reducing friction is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make things easier. But, and it's a big but, we have to be very cognizant about when we want to add friction and when we need to slow things down, when we need to, and I love the San Pellegrino can example, right? That by adding friction, it changes the perception of the drink. Cleanliness, the desirability. Obviously, this must be high end because I have to do this extra step. And those are little things that we don't take into consideration. And I think it's really important.
Luxury brands have done this for a long time. You don't just like buying a yacht. Not like I have any personal experience, but I've noticed but
my friends have all bought their yachts. And
the last yacht that I bought, no, I've never bought one. But I've been interested in the way that they market their products, and you don't just pick up the phone and call them or send them an email and say, "Give me a quote." There's a process that you have to sort of demonstrate you're not just serious about it, but you're qualified before they engage in a serious conversation. There's some vetting that goes on, and that adds to the perception of the quality of the product.
Yeah.
It just increases that.
So I do want to make sure that we touch on the Danny Oppenheimer study. Consequence. I can't pronounce this. The consequences of erudite vernacular utilized irrespective of necessity. Problems with using long words needlessly.
Yes.
2006, right? And this idea, I just find it fascinating because we don't necessarily see using big words as being smarter, which is counterintuitive. And I just love this. Yeah,
it is. It's pretty great. And I did check. He did win the 2006 Ig Nobel Award in literature for that paper, by the way. So that was pretty great. And for those of you who don't know, the Ig Nobel Award is given by Harvard, by like very bright Harvard professors when they see an opportunity to sort of lampoon the Nobel Prize, basically. So he did win. But yeah, this counterintuitive result and observation is something that marketers and HR departments can put to use. They can start thinking about the kind of words that they're using when they're writing emails for their executives, for instance, to announce a back to work plan or something like that. Simpler words are going to not just appear smarter, but they're going to be more effective for people to take action from.
And again, using concrete words that are appropriate and relatable, all going to help.
Yeah.
All right. I'm ready to go out and buy a coffee, and hopefully it'll be a free one. What do you think?
It depends on whether or not your barista is going to, give you a little, bonus on the side for no charge, a little extra this or that, or is it going to require you just to buy 10, get one free?
Well, let's talk about, you've done work with Rand Kivitz and your favorite study on coffee, free stuff. Which one is this?
Yes. So Ron did this, wonderful study that you and I have talked about a lot over the years.
I use it way too much, but yeah, I love it.
But it's so great. So Kivitz went to the coffee shop at Stanford and got them to agree to have two different kinds of cards for a loyalty program. One was your standard buy 10, get one free. And the other one was buy 12, get one free. But the first two are on the house. And so what he wasn't testing randomness so much as he was actually testing and sort of proving out Clark Hall's illusionary progress toward the goal effect. And this is a wonderful thing I think that marketers underutilize, right? Both of us, I think you'd agree with that, Kurt, that it's underutilized in the world.
Right. This idea that progress. So the result of that study was, all right, both, if you got the 10 punch card or the 12 punch card, it didn't matter because you still both had to actually buy 10 coffees or 10 drinks to get the free one. But what that study showed is that because there were 12 and you had 2 pre-punched, people felt like you were making progress towards that goal, illusionary goal progress that Clark Hall talked about. And thus you were more motivated to get those punches. And on average, it was almost 3 days faster, is 12.1 days versus 15 point something. I forget, don't quote me on the exact, but it was almost 3 days faster that they redeemed those cards, which is, again, it's 10 punches, both of them. You need 10 punches on both. It shouldn't matter, but that's not how our brains work. And this also goes, so going back to randomness, which we were talking about with Richard, right? Yes. This idea of a variable ratio, this reinforcement of rewards on a variable manner, it'd be very interesting to see, like, again, if maybe you had a loyalty card that came in, you swiped it every time, and it was just a random, you know, and boom, hey, this time I get a free one. But we don't use that variable reinforcement even inside of organizations and in the rewards and recognition world that we work in, right? It's there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the variable reinforcement goes back to B.F. Skinner. He was the one that actually coined it. And again, we have our issues with Skinner.
Oh yeah.
And at the same time, he did some really great work. And the variable award reinforcement model is very powerful. I think that he stated that it produces high, steady rates of response. Yeah. High, steady rates of response. I mean, that's a really telling thing. If you want someone to do a behavior over and over again, consider this variable ratio reinforcement model. And again, inside the organization, customers, we've got to test it. We got to put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, you could use it in a peer-to-peer program where, hey, peer-to-peer, you recognize somebody, and it's just a standard recognition. Hey, great job, Tim. Thank you for all you do. But hey, 1 out of every 30 times I do that, or 10 times, or whatever the ratio is, the person I'm recognizing gets a huge award, or I get an award for giving that recognition. And that can really change that. I will caution. I think United Airlines did this. I think they must have read some of this research somewhere, but they took away a program for gate agents and the people that are getting the planes ready to fly off on time. They had a award that was in there that, hey, over the course of a year, that gate agent and others could probably maybe earn a few hundred to maybe a little over 1,000. Top earners were making maybe a little over 1,000. So not a ton of money, but
for good performance on the job,
on making sure that the planes got off on time, right? And so however they did on doing that, and they replaced it with this, instead of like, you're getting, every time a plane goes off on time, you earn an X amount. It was, you got this entry into a lottery, and the lottery was, one person was going to win $100,000, and 10 people were going to get a Mercedes-Benz lease for a year, and it backfired immensely.
But why did it backfire?
Why do you think?
It backfired because the employees didn't like it.
Right. But the employees didn't like it, because you took something away. A loss aversion.
Yep.
But B, it also is this element where, again, many of these people were thinking, well, $500, $700, $1,000, probably not all that much. But that was a pretty consistent amount of money that they had become accustomed to and used to. And so we have to be very careful about how we implement these types of programs. It should be an add-on and not a replacement. So.
Yeah, good. I just wanted to point that out, that in and of itself, the concept may not have been ideal, but it wasn't awful.
Right.
The way that they executed it was pretty poor.
Yeah. So all right, we've gone way too long already, Tim. I'm sure there's a bunch more that we could talk about, but those were the high points for me.
Yeah, I think me too. Could I also just say that there was a comment that you made near the end of our discussion, and this might be a little bit random to say this, but it was about music and how hard it is to follow bands today. We were talking about how Spotify sort of brings so much new music to someone that it's really hard to just get to know a band. Spotify doesn't tee up the same band every time you listen, right? They're they're kind of adding friction into really digging into a particular band's catalog.
Yeah, and it's hard to listen to an album. I mean, as much as you would like to maybe listen to an album from start to finish, it's hard, and it makes sense that Spotify picks only the most popular artists that are getting big followings, and if you're not in that top tier, well, I'm sorry, Tim, but you're not going to get raised up into most people's playlists. So
no, but we are in the top tier of behavioral science podcasts.
Oh, nice! Yes,
how about that?
Yeah.
And thank you to all the groovers who helped us get there, and thank you to Gabs.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Gabs. Thank you to all the people who listen to this on a regular basis, and for voting for us, and for just taking, just listening. We do really appreciate it. And we hope that you can take and apply some of the insights from this episode and Richard's conversation, or any of the conversations that we had with the many great guests that we've had in our 354 episodes that we've done. And we hope that this helps you go out and find your group.